2-month lockdown due to COVID-19 pandemic and the sudden halt of marine activity on our reefs, and looking at what that has done to the fish populations in the time since activity has been gradually returning to our reefs. First, we're going to be doing a 15-minute presentation. Would be followed by a panel discussion with Dr. Gahari and Catherine Gills, who join us at that time. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Gretchen Goodbody-Gringley. She's CCMI's Director of Research, has been with CCMI since January of 2020, so just prior to our COVID-19 lockdown. Prior to that, Dr. Goodbody-Gringley was an assistant scientist at the Bermuda Institute of Ocean Sciences, or REOS, where she led the Reef Ecology and Evolution Laboratory. Dr. Goodbody-Gringley completed her Bachelor of Science at the University of Georgia, and she received her PhD from Harvard University in the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology. She then held doctoral positions at Marine Laboratory and the University of Bologna, Italy. She has broad background in marine biology and particularly interested in evolution of life strategies and how that in turn serves structure population dynamics and maintain diversity. Dr. Goodbody-Gringley, her research focuses on population structure, reproductive ecology, and genetic connectivity of a variety of organisms that inhabit tropical coral reef ecosystems ranging from inshore shallow reefs down to the mesophoton, with the goal of understanding how ecosystems function in order to maintain biodiversity. Darwin Initiative, additional support provided by walkers. So, Dr. Goodbody-Gringley.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you of the populations and really see firsthand how our activities might be affecting our local fish. So of course, when people come here, and one of the reasons we are really interested in looking at this study is, what they want to see are healthy reefs. They want to see healthy fish populations. That's one of the main things we offer as a tourism product, is we have one of the healthiest coral reef ecosystems in the Caribbean. And so if we lose that resource, that can then have a negative impact on our local economy. So understanding how our day-to-day activities might affect these populations will ultimately impact how we reopen, how we strategize with our tourism product in order to maintain the integrity of our system while also being in our economy. And so one of the reasons we're really interested in what this means to our fish populations, so this concept of water-based activity and how that might impact indirectly fish populations. So the oceans are not quiet normally. There is always a lot of sound going on underwater that's produced by all of the animals that live there. There are shrimp snapping, making a lot of noises, parrotfish crunching on the reef, and you can hear them biting. You can hear all sorts of little clicks and grunts, and generally it's noisy. You may notice if you dive because you primarily hear is breathing in and out. But we, as a research team, also some live breathers, and when you have that quiet, you can actually hear everything that's happening underwater. But what's really interesting is that we have found over the last several decades that the noise that we make as humans on our oceans actually produces a frequency that is quite similar to what's produced by nature. And so this can have major impacts on how these organisms are communicating with one another, how they're perceiving sound, how they're receiving sound, because, for example, the noise that we produce through shipping, through energy resources, all overlap with the sound that are produced by whales and by small fish and by crustaceans, and also just the natural sound that lives in the ocean and moving. And so how does this actually impact fish? Well, it's been found that the noise that we produce can in fact compromise the ability of fish to sense and utilize sound. So what does this mean? Well, this can mean that fish might respond differently to the presence of a predator because maybe they can't hear that predator approaching. So the response time could be lower, and this would result in higher predation than would exist in the natural scenario. It could result in them hiding more frequently in the reef, and this could then in turn impact how frequently they feed or how they reproduce. There's also been studies on the biology of fishes, which has shown that, in fact, the presence of constant high-frequency noise can impact even things like their heart rate. So they'll have an elevated heart rate, an elevated blood cortisol level, and they will, in fact, respond basically with a stress response. And we can see this in just not only their physiology, but even in their genomics. So changes in gene expression associated with stress. So this can disrupt the entire ecosystem. And so even by not realizing what we're doing, we're just boating around, we're swimming in the ocean, and even just that minimal impact can affect our fish populations. So when we have large groups of tourists, large fishing boats, or cruise ships, shipping industry in and out of our port, of course that will have an even greater impact. So what we wanted to do with this project was, as soon as lockdown happened, I was talking with several local people who were like, I wonder what the fish are doing. I wonder what the fish are doing. And it's like, yeah, well, I wonder what the fish are doing. And so that sparked us to think, like, well, as soon as they let us out, let's go and see what the fish are doing. And that's exactly what we did. So March of last year came COVID and lockdown. And here in Cayman, as any of you who are resident here will remember, that it was quite strict, the measures that we took. And it was 3 months of relatively no activity. We weren't even allowed to the beach. And so the fish were not impacted by us really any major way. So as soon as we were allowed out, which happened the end of June, we started our initial surveys. And we went to 5 sites in and around Georgetown Harbor, so starting down at Dom Foster's and all the way up to Bonnie's Arch. We went and counted all of the fish that we would see along a 30-meter transect line. So to do this, we basically lay out a large measuring tape underwater, and we create sort of a virtual cube that we're counting all the fish that we see as we swim along, and we estimate their size. And we then repeated this every 2 months going forward. So we initially thought, we were going to open up again. We thought we'd catch the opening, and we would be able to monitor how the fish responded to the opening. And what ended up happening was that we remained closed. We are still closed. And so what we're monitoring now is sort of the natural response of the fish populations to our gradual resumption of activity locally. And I think that that's interesting, and you'll see from the data that we found that we can see some trends in how just our minimal local activities are also impacting fish. So if we just dive right into what we found, I should preface this with, we compared what we were finding post-COVID to a set of surveys that we conducted in 2018, again along the west side of Cayman. And so we were able to have very similar methodology in order to look at how fish changed pre-COVID, post-COVID. So here we're looking at the density of the fish that we saw along our transects. So we have 2018, which is pre-COVID, and then July 2020, and then every 2 months thereafter, up until just this month. So what we found was there was an initial significant increase in the density of fish post-COVID, which we think probably happened almost immediately. I think if we had been able to get out there, 1 month, 2 months after lockdown, we probably would have seen a similar result. So this, again, was 3 months after lockdown happened. We were out there counting the fish, and we already saw this drastic response in the increase in density. However, as we began to resume our local activities, so now we were talking about, just local boaters going out, diving activity with only local residents, local fishermen, and we start to see this gradual decline in the densities, which is quite interesting because even though, they show this capacity to rebound almost immediately in the absence of a disturbance, we also found that they were impacted by the resumption of just minimum local activities. And I think that we can use this information going forward to make predictions of how they potentially will respond as we increase those activities. So not only did we look at how many fish there are, we also looked at what kinds of fish we saw. And so again, we're looking at 2018 as our comparison for pre-COVID. And you can see that in 2018, on the west end of Cayman, we found that all the fish in our surveys represented 3 different families or types of fish species, and which were the grunts, the parrotfish, and the snappers. Post-COVID, we actually saw a significant increase in species richness, or the number of fish that we saw in our surveys. And you can see now that we're finding a much more homogeneous distribution of representatives from a wide variety of different species groups. And so now we're finding, for example, the presence of grouper are more common, jacks in the lime green are more common. We're finding more sturgeon fishes here on the bottom, and also chubs. And what's really interesting is that some of our previous work here has shown that sturgeon fishes and chubs are actually very important herbivores, and they're responsible for removing quite a lot of algae from our reefs. So the finding that we're having an increase in sturgeon fishes and chubs can be very important in terms of how the algae is maintained and the overall integrity of our coral system. And that's also represented when we look at these fish in terms of the trophic guild that they represent. So here you can see in this line graph, these are the different trophic groups. So in red, we have herbivores, blue is invertebrates, green is carnivores, purple is omnivores, and orange is planktivores. I apologize if you're colorblind, and that made no sense to you. But what I want to point out is that the top line, which is the herbivores, showed a significant increase in the abundance of herbivores post-COVID. So again, this highlights the importance that this reduced activity or reduced disturbance is enabling herbivores to rebuild their populations, which ultimately is linked to long-term stability of coral ecosystems. And one of the main drivers for that change was this jump in parrotfish. So we saw a very clear and significant spike in parrotfish populations in our post-COVID surveys, and they have remained stable since. So while we did see the overall density of fish is declining, parrotfish are in fact still remaining stable over time throughout our recovery period. Again, this is really important. Parrotfish consume a lot of algae. Algae are in direct competition with corals, and many studies have linked parrotfish abundances to long-term stability and health of coral reefs. So this is a really great finding and really important for how we look at managing our coral reef populations going forward. Another group that we found increased immediately after COVID was the presence of large group. So these were Nassau groupers, tiger groupers. We were seeing black groupers right there in Georgetown Harbor, which we were all very excited about. It was really cool to be swimming along and see these big groupers, hanging out under an overhang that previously, we would not see in Georgetown. And what's important about the presence of fish like grouper is that if you have an increase in your top predators, what it signifies is that the ecosystem is becoming more balanced and is able to support the entire food chain, all the way from these small little herbivorous fish up to your large grouper and potentially sharks. And we in fact saw this when we looked at the size of the fish over time. So here we're starting in time July at the top, and it moves through time downwards. And what I want to just point out here is the presence of these really large fish start to come into play as we move forward in time. And so even though the average size of the fish didn't change from pre-COVID to post-COVID, what we did find was we were seeing the presence of a few very large individuals that previously had not been spotted. But in addition to that, we saw a large increase in the tiniest fish. So these are fish that are less than 5 centimeters in length. And so what it indicates is that our impacts onto the reef, not only at the biggest fish, but also the tiniest fish. So it has ramifications all the way through the food chain. So just to wrap this up and summarize what we found that the fish populations can rebound almost immediately when a disturbance is removed, but they are still impacted even by our local small-scale or minimal activities that are currently occurring on our reef. And in particular, we saw increases in parrotfishes and groupers. These are not only important to maintaining the health of our ecosystem, but they're also important to our tourism product. A lot of people that come to dive in Cayman, that's what they want to see. They want to see those big grouper. They want to see beautiful, colorful parrotfish. So it's really important that we keep tabs on how those populations are doing moving forward. But overall, these results indicate that the removal of this disturbance will promote a healthier reef ecosystem, because we're finding this increase in herbivores that can maintain the algae and ultimately will result in long-term stability of our coral reefs. And finally, we found that our activities that we perform on the water not only affect the largest fish, but also the smallest fish. So this has ramifications throughout the food chain. Okay, so what do we do from here? Where do we go from here? You know, this has become kind of a hot topic in coral reef science right now, is the impact of sound and our activities indirect on the fish populations. And so there was a paper that just recently came out in Science 2021, so this is quite new, where they're talking about this exact subject and looking at, you know, here we are now in the Anthropocene, and that all of our activities, how is that impacting large migratory species as well as residential fish communities, and how can we change our management strategies to take those into account? And so I think that moving forward, it's really important that we have information like this that can inform our tourism models, can inform how we approach our ecosystem management, so that we make the best decisions to protect what we have here as our, you know, our main resource, which is the coral reef and the communities that live there. Some suggestions that were given by Duarte et al., for example, were to look for methods to reduce high boat traffic on our most diverse coral reef sites, and maybe look for new and advanced technologies that incorporate quieter propellers in these large commercial vessels that would potentially impact our fish populations. So as we approach today's discussion, this is one thing that I would really like to highlight is, you know, how do we in fact move forward? How do we take this kind of information and think about our tourism product and what we want to do as a community here to manage and conserve our coral reefs? And I'd just like to thank our main sponsors. As Robin indicated, this has been primarily funded by a Darwin Initiative grant from the UK, from the Department DEFRA of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and as well as from Walkers and several other donations as well. So we appreciate your time, and we would like to welcome our panelists up at this time, and we can open for discussion. Oh, maybe I should just.
Okay, so is it on? So thank you again, Gretchen, and we'd like to welcome Catherine Childs from the National Trust joining our panel, as well as Dr. Guy Harvey from the Guy Harvey Ocean Foundation. Thank you again for joining us today. It's a very important thing, and our team thought that it was worth creating a panel to discuss the study, because this is an important topic that is of interest to many in the Cayman Islands, in general, people who love coral reefs. So we are honored to create this panel to show what we know from the study, and of course what this means as things open and marine activity continues to increase in our post-COVID world. And we hope that we can answer any questions that members of our audience, both in person and through our online webinar, have during this time. So to get started, for our online visitors, I would just like to ask you, if you have a question, to please type it into the chat box on the right side of your screen, and we will relay that to our panelists so they can, and if you have someone specific that you would like to provide their input, please put their name in that as well, so we can direct the question to them. But I will get started with a question while we wait for some folks to think about what they would like to ask. So, Gretchen, you said that you saw that the density of fish populations increased immediately, and then has started to decrease as we've gone through the 9 months of the study. Why do you think that that was observed?
Yeah, so as I said in the talk, I do think that fish are able to respond quite quickly when a disturbance is removed. I did find it quite interesting, and I think probably you all can comment on this as well, that even just the small amount of activity that we're doing locally right now was enough to show a decline over time. And so what those activities are, you know, I guess local dining and just boat traffic. We are right in the harbor, and one thing, I could actually go to the graph. One thing you might note here is the drop down in December, which I found really interesting, and we as a group had a lot of discussion back and forth, like, oh, do you think Christmas and shipping, could that have caused a, you know, more influx of the large container ships? So those kinds of activities, I think, are primarily what's happening.
I thought this was a really useful study. Thank you. Simply because you took advantage of an exceptional situation, which we were trying to do with the stingrays at a corresponding time for this reason. What happens to the animals? But in thinking about the long-term value of a study like this, now that we have marine park expansion from 15% to 45%, which happened a couple of weeks ago, it's all the more reason for you to continue the study, but in some of the places that just became designated as no-take areas, to measure the effect of the conservation. It is so important to see if what you're doing is right through. The problem with the DOE, you're looking at the only three NGOs that exist in the island right here, is that they are underfunded and, you know, overworked. They can't possibly do all this work themselves, and so it's important that we jump up and participate and show that take the to do studies. This would be really good to do somewhere that's just designated as marine park that used to be fished, for example, because the fish respond very quickly. They know.
Okay, so we have a question from our audience here.
Gretchen, which did you use the same sites in 2018 and 2020?
They weren't the exact same sites, but they encompassed the same scope of area. So even though they weren't the exact same reef, we feel that they were well representative of what we were surveying.
Would you expect to see annual deviations in fish populations?
Most definitely. There are always fluctuations in recruitment cycles, so how successful the last brood cycle or reproduction cycle was will impact the next season and the next year, and things like weather can affect that as well. Or, you know, even if there's a volcano that erupts somewhere else, that can actually impact things like the reproductive cycle of our fish. So yes.
Does the decline from March through till December reflect any expected annual declines?
So potentially, yes, there is an aspect of that in this study, and that is that a lot of recruitment for fish species happen in the summertime. And so that high number in July may be representative of a pulse in the recruitment of fish onto the reef in the summertime. So going forward, I think what's really important is to continue these so that we get a full annual cycle.
Where do you think when these fish are coming? I think you answer that. They're coming from the reef onto...
So I think a lot of fish are hiding in the nooks and crannies of the reef. I think that the large fish probably leave and go somewhere else where they're not impacted. I mean, Guy probably has some more information on that.
I was going to say, these are magical fish coming out of nowhere. They're somewhere else, and taking the opportunity of breeding environment, especially the grazers, because of the factor is not there anymore. So they quickly recognize that. Yep.
Okay, our next question. Okay, I do have one from online. It's how will reef fish and impact on the local reef impact the wider ecosystem?
Yes. So in general are very important for the entire ecosystem. Just as the coral support the fish support the coral. And primarily that is with the presence of these herbivores. So algae grows very quickly. Cyanobacteria will grow very quickly, particularly in a warm climate like ours. And if there aren't enough herbivores to keep that algal growth in check, then they can negatively impact coral. So over time, if you don't have a healthy fish population, your coral population will in fact begin to deteriorate. And so, having this balance of healthy fish populations in turn will result in healthy coral populations. And they really are critical to maintaining each other. And this is really getting at the heart of how does an ecosystem function? Do all the various players participate and have an impact on the overall health? And really that comes down to everything has its role, and we need every single different kind of organism there.
Absolutely true. And so the question is, what happened to all the herbivores?
Yeah.
Well, in many other Caribbean islands, there's so much fish trap activity, overfishing. I'm from Jamaica. I know all about overfishing. There's very few fish left. And the target species, the herbivores, the surgeon fish, the chubs, and the parrotfishes. You saw on Gretchen's charts just how many parrotfish there were around, which is pretty healthy compared to many other Caribbean islands. So if you have more marine parks, or you control your fishing, as the DOE has done here, effectively by limiting the number of fish traps, assigning them to individual people, limiting the number of traps per person, go and do it, because this is a indiscriminate form of fishing that is extremely destructive. And it's a political will that will keep them out of the water more than anything else, based on the science, because of all the values that have been told. They are crucial to the health of the coral reef. The predators thrive in the coral reef, the topography, because it provides a home. The coral depends on the lack of algae around. And if you look at old pictures from Jamaica, 1975, 1978, lots of beautiful coral reefs, but no fish. And there was disaster coming because of the fish.
So I'm with the National Trust, which is more of an outreach organization. We work really hard to make sure that these facts get to the public, and that we protect what's special about Cayman Islands and Cayman natural and historic heritage. So we've created a few things. You can come by our office in Dart Park and pick up. I brought some you can take home. One is a lionfish cookbook to promote the eating of lionfish, which is a invasive species here in the Cayman Islands. It doesn't belong here. And we also have a little guide, consistent guide to help use what kind of wheat. So you'll find parrotfish on the red line here. Those are ones that you should avoid. Two reasons that Guy was talking about, parrotfish is so important on the reef, we can't afford to be fishing those species. Conversely, there's a green line here that has ideas of fish that are ones that are more sustainable to eat. And this has fish populations, but also fishing techniques, as I was linked to some of the techniques be really detrimental to ecosystems. So I'm going to have these here if you guys want to pick any up on the way out, or I only brought a small sample. I also have a sticker you can promote it on your car. Stop by our office in Dart Park too, and feel free to pick that up.
I see some questions in the back. Let me go.
There's a couple of questions and a comment, which was I was surprised to understand that sound had such an impact. I think often about the warming of the waters and plastic and chemicals that go in the water that would have this impact. I really appreciated hearing about sound. I'm wondering about the work that you've done on this study and how it's being shared throughout the Caribbean. Are there other studies that are being done on the other islands? so that there's some more collaboration, a building of these kinds of effects, so that collectively you address these things. For example, our cruise industry, among other things, in a collective way. Because I was hoping myself that this would happen last year. It was such a rare opportunity. So I want to say thank you to you for that. And my second question was, there is the coral reefs are being impacted by a virus of some sort. If maybe you could clarify what's happening with that, and perhaps share a little bit more about. You just shared a little bit about the sort of the relationship between corals and fish and the balance, and perhaps that we were seeing because of the imbalance that's happened over the last prior to COVID, that there was an imbalance, and perhaps that's what caused the virus to attack the coral reefs, or if it's even a virus. Maybe you can help me understand a little bit better what's happening right now and how that's being addressed.
So for the first question, I expect there are similar studies happening elsewhere in the world. I know that our particular funding source is for UK overseas territories, and they were looking for projects that addressed changes in biodiversity as a result of COVID. So I do know that across the UK OT, there are likely similar projects funded by the same granting body to address this topic. I think mechanisms like this webinar and our live underwater broadcast, get them even globally, and you're doing a similar project. I would be really interested in sharing ideas and talking about how we can merge projects. In terms of the new disease that is affecting our coral populations, she's referring to the stony coral tissue loss disease, which made its first appearance in June of 2020. This is primarily being handled by the Department of Environment, but we do know that it has spread across the north side of Grand Cayman and is currently threatening the west side. And this disease we believe to be bacterial in origin. It is thought to be spread potentially in the water. It started in Florida about 5 to 7 years ago, and has had major impacts on the coral populations there. That's because it can affect a lot of different coral species, and not only that, the mortality rate is very high once the disease is present. So there is a lot of concern about how we are going to manage the presence of stony coral tissue loss disease now in Grand Cayman. It's a huge concern for all of us that are in this field, for sure. We don't know exactly how it got here, because if it was just waterborne, we probably would have gotten here earlier. So there is a lot of speculation how and why, the timing. It was very point source at the initiation and has spread out since then. Going forward, the DOE is working with several different collaborators abroad and locally. The main strategy right now is applying an antibiotic directly to the corals, and so they are trying to enlist the local community to assist in terms of providing boat usage, divers, hands in the water. So if you're interested in getting involved, helping the DOE with the Skittle D management crisis, we encourage you to go to the DOE website, and particularly to talk to either Croy McCoy or Tammy Warrender.
Add something to add to the spreading of the groundbreaking research work conducted here in the Cayman Islands, the Caribbean countries, because we all share the same problems. I'll add that the research work on the groupers in Little Cayman, which is another long-term study, it's been going on for 19 years now. The recovery rate of the groupers was much slower than we anticipated, with all the resources thrown into it. That includes the Department of Environment. It includes the Reef Environmental Education Foundation, who are leaders. But I realize, having been around in this program going on for years, nobody was telling a story of how it was being achieved and the immense success that was happening. So we made a documentary in 2011 called The Mystery of the Grouper Moon, with a follow-up documentary in 2017 to show the results of effective conservation research and education, and export that idea to many other Caribbean countries who do the same thing. All suffer from this iconic reef fish, the Nassau grouper, one of the 6 reef groupers. And so it's important to tell the story where conservation works, because there are so many sad stories about it, not overfishing in particular, reef dying and so on, apart from other dramatic effects like ship groundings and oil spills and stuff. This is a long-term event. It's a generational study, and in another decade we'll be back to where we were, probably exploitation. So it's just as important as the research we've done to tell the story about how it's been done, why it's important, and how you guys can help.
Okay, we have an online question. Could the changes between 2018 and 2020, post-lockdown, the surveys be attributed to anything other than just the reduced human activities?
Scope for other factors coming into play. Probably, I have a mic here. Probably with this particular instance, there could have been some interactions with the work of the DOE and the fact that our marine protected areas are so expansive. They're doing a great job with management of that, and that could have potentially impacted the fish populations. I would expect that that would probably have been gradual over time, not this huge spike. So we do think that even though there may have been some impacts of strong management practices, that this huge spike was primarily due to the absence of an activity.
I have a question from one of our participants in the gallery.
Thank you. This is actually a question to Dr. Harvey first, and then for the whole panel. The question is, we know that stingray was quite impacted because, well, first we had no tourists, but also we had nobody giving food to the stingrays. I'd be interested to see if what you saw at Stingray City was reflective of what Gretchen found in the research on the quiet oceans. And the entire panel, we have an election coming up. What can we do to educate our current people running to become members of Parliament in terms of ensuring that our oceans are kept better?
Dr. Harvey?
So thanks for the question. So we expect the stingray population to decline, which it did, because the constant replenishment isn't there. There's no other reason. It's been since the mid-1980s. So what has built up is what we call considerable site fidelity. They identify the constant feeding pattern, the food, and what more can I say? They're going to leave if there's no food. So even during the DOE were not to go and feed them. And once they got some exempt status, they could go out there and start feeding them. And we were requested to keep a count at log, and they would feed them for a length of time every day. And the numbers had crashed. They'd gone down to like 25, 28 animals, which was expected. And after Ivan, maybe the same thing happened, but the punishment started pretty soon, 6 after, not 3 months after. So we fed them on a regular basis every day. Then they handed it over to us, which is time-consuming and expensive. We did our first survey in July last year, first weekend in July. There were only 50 rays counted. There are normally about 110 or 120 in our surveys. And then the next did was October. It had gone down further. It was down to about 42, 43. This is a 3-day survey, same time done every time. What do you call an exhaustive survey? Then the government, well, a group got together of the tour operators and said, hey, we need help. We can go and feed them every day, but pay us and pay for the food. And that worked, because the next survey we did in January this year, first weekend in January, we're up to about 75 rays. So we're up to about nearly 3/4 of what we expect to see. So that was expected. If you don't maintain that site fidelity for the animals, they will leave. And there are certain animals that we never saw in our service because they're all tagged. We know them all. And so we knew there were several missing. To the other point, I think every candidate needs to beef up on their marine science, 101, because this is the crucial factor. And there's another thing I want to talk about afterwards regarding healthy coral once maybe Kathy, you can have a shot at this.
Sure. So definitely some candidates are better than others. I think we all know that. But I am encouraged to see that many of them are putting a big part of their platform toward the environment this time. I've never seen signs along the roadside asking you to vote for them because they're concerned about the environment for future generations. So that's a really encouraging sign to me that this is so important to the people, that the politicians are picking up on that and basing part of their platform on their willingness to protect the environment, which is great, but we also need to hold them to that after the election as well. So I implore you, if you can vote, to vote and to choose somebody who is a candidate that is strong for the environment, both below the waterline and above, by the way. Yes, please. I'm not going to talk about individual candidates today, but I think that it's probably pretty easy to find out exactly who are the best ones from that focus on that. So thanks very much. Did you have any? Oh, you don't need to.
No.
And then you want to.
Well, any other questions?
We do have one more question that has come in. So we have a question from one of our online participants, Bruce, who says that he assumes that cruise ships have yet to return to the Cayman Islands. That is correct, and that there is no indication of when that might be changed at this point. And his interest was in the post-COVID study results and how much of the ratio, like the relative ratio in change in fish populations, do you think is attributed to the lack of cruise ships specifically versus other activity, maybe like the diving, the snorkeling, individual jet skis?
Sure. Really hard to tease those apart. A lot of the activities that happen on our waters happen in the vicinity of the cruise ships. So normally when a cruise ship is in port, there are people on jet skis all around. Normally they're from the cruise ships, but there's also the tenders going back and forth. There's all sorts of shore-based water activities as well, all along 7 Mile Beach. So it's really difficult to tease apart, what's from the cruise ship versus what's from the shipping, for example, or from local dive operators. However, I would think that probably the majority of the impact of sound is from these cruise ships, particularly in the way that we operate cruise ships here with the dynamic positioning. If you have been diving in and around 7 Mile Beach area, it's quite loud underwater when the port is full. So I think that probably a large component of this is related to cruise ship industry. And that's one thing that the paper that just came out in Science did point to, was that as technologies are being better developed, there are new ways that we can incorporate quieter propellers, quieter generators into these cruise ships as they begin to return, and just really think about that impact that they're having.
Oops, sorry. I was just going to add something real quick. So I just want to say that this study is just looking at sound, which we're finding is, I think many of us are surprised that it had such a strong effect on the behavior of the fish. And I would just say that as we move forward in time with climate change, with more people, and we have more and more stresses on the reef and in the marine ecosystem, that whatever we can do, whatever small thing we can do to relieve some of that can actually have a big impact on the resiliency of that ecosystem, meaning that it will be able to go forward in time, maybe to overcome some of the stresses associated with warmer waters or stronger storms or more runoff from the land because of people developing. Whatever it might be, they can withstand that a little bit better if there's one thing less that we are putting on the pressures of that reef. Like it's death by 1,000 cuts. Let's just do a little bit less, and it really makes a big impact. As we saw, just stopping some of our impact on the reef had a huge impact. And I actually take this as is a very encouraging and hopeful sign that, that it can rebound if we give it a chance.
There's no doubt about that. Marine systems generally are very resilient. One of the unseen enemies, which really seriously affects coral reefs worldwide, excuse me, is the seepage of sewage water, cesspit water, and so on. And when you multiply the effect of many houses being built in an area without a centralized sewage system, all that waste goes into the ground, even though it's partially treated. But the nutrients escape to the sea because the base rock is porous. We're on a calcium carbonate crust here. And so water flows freely. Anybody who has a garden irrigation system knows that. And so when I was doing my research work for yet another, another focus that we should have been paying attention to rather than building the cruise ship dock, was having a really first-class waste management system and sewage system for the island. Do you know the percentage of sewage that is treated on island right now by the centralized Water Authority Commission? It's 20%. So all the rest of the stuff goes into the ground, it leaches out, nitrates and phosphates get onto the reef, and what loves nitrates and phosphates? Algae. So, you know, your grazers are going to have a hard time keeping up with the constant fertilizing of the algae. So these are all things, and last week you were reminded again about the presence of the dump. Well, the dump is not lined, and all the bad stuff goes through this porous substrate, mostly out into North Sound, and on a really grotty day, if you're taking off and flying out over the North Sound, you can see the brown stain that emanates from there. And all of these things can be fixed, but they all affect the coral reef. And so it's not just one thing, the noise, it's not just ships, it's not just people, but all the consequences have to be addressed to get back to some sort of pristine situation. And you just have to go to Little Cayman and see the difference, you know.
Great. Those are some excellent points, that it's not just one thing, it's a multifaceted problem that we can take into consideration. Which leads me, we are basically at the end of our time together. I appreciate everyone joining us, but I would like to give the panel one more opportunity to share final thoughts and one thing that they would like everyone to take home from the presentation or from our discussion today. So maybe we can begin with Dr. Guy Harvey.
I want to thank Gretchen for the work the CCMI is doing. I think it can go further than this, and if the grant givers can continue their work, then it takes cash to care. So keep up the great work. What we can all do, because whether you live in the middle of Cayman or close to it, our actions directly affect the sea, no matter where you live. Even if it's in the top of a mountain in Jamaica, you're still going to affect the sea with what you do. So just be aware of that. And thank you for the opportunity.
I would just like to remind people that this is a big part of Cayman culture, to be involved with the marine environment. The people who came here, that have been here for generations, that's a big part of the culture. And so it's important to retain that culture, to maintain the integrity and the biodiversity of our coral reefs and the animals that live there. So I just encourage everybody to please do what we can to see what we have now taken forward for future generations to enjoy as well.
Thanks. I don't know. So I just want to thank both of you for joining me on the panel today. I really appreciate your input, and also thank everyone for joining us virtually and in person. I think one thing I would like to reiterate as we take forward is that I think Dr. Harvey pointed to this, but I think the ultimate message is hopeful, that we can have a positive change by just making really minimal adjustments to our lifestyles. And even though we might not physically think that the choices that we make have a direct impact onto the reef, I think this study shows that in fact they do. You know, just things that you don't even notice that you're doing on topside can impact what's happening under the water. So I think the takeaway would be just what both Kathy and Guy have said, which is, you know, think about your choices and how every action you take does affect the environment.
I would also like to see more marine education, marine science education in schools here. I think it's,
More education in schools is definitely needed.
yeah. And so another question for your potential candidates is, what emphasis are you going to put on the marine environment going forward? Because the kids mop up all this stuff. They love it. And they pay attention. Yep.
Excellent. Well, again, thank you for joining us, Dr. Guy Harvey, Catherine Childs, and all of our audience, both locally and online. Hopefully this is not the end of this study. Do we have potential plans to continue?
Well, this is the actual end of this particular study. However, we are hoping to continue these surveys going forward. And so we will see how things unfold, and hopefully we'll be back in the water in 2 months.
Excellent. Just so everyone knows, if you're interested in watching this again, you wanted to review the information, CCMI will be posting this on our social media channels as well as on our website, so anyone can enjoy the presentation and discussion, and we will continue to share our findings as they come out, and hopefully we will soon meet again to discuss some more interesting research that's coming out of our little Cayman Research Center. Thank you again, and have a wonderful day.